For 5 centuries, the definition of power has remained remarkably consistent, even as its instruments have changed. In the 15th century, power was land. To be a member of the landed aristocracy was to own the physical reality of the world, the soil, the grain, and the people who worked it. The duke or the earl did not merely own a business, he owned a territory. His wealth was visible in the horizon, and his status was maintained by the sheer necessity of his existence. If you wanted to eat, you worked his land. If you wanted to survive, you lived within his walls. This was the era of the static empire, where wealth was slow, heavy, and anchored to the earth. By the 18th century, the nature of dominance shifted from the soil to the sea. The great merchant dynasties of Europe, from the Medici to the Fuggers and eventually the architects of the East India Company, realized that the true source of wealth was no longer the possession of the land itself, but the control of the routes between it. Power became a matter of logistics, of spice, of silk, and of the capital required to ensure a fleet against the whims of the ocean. This was the first iteration of the global network, where the ruling class was defined by its ability to move value across vast distances. Wealth became more abstract, represented by ledgers and letters of credit, yet it remained fundamentally tied to the labor of thousands of sailors, clerks, and colonial subjects. The 19th century brought the most violent reorganization of power in human history. The Industrial Revolution replaced the merchant with the industrialist. The Carnegies, the Rockefellers, and the Vanderbilts did not care for the elegance of the ledger as much as they cared for the heat of the furnace and the weight of the rail. They built the physical nervous system of the modern world. They understood that if you owned the steel mills, the oil refineries, and the railroad tracks, you owned the future. This was the birth of the capital-intensive empire. It required a massive commitment of resources, a staggering amount of debt, and a ruthless willingness to consolidate. The industrialist was the first modern figure to realize that people were a variable, while infrastructure was a constant. As we moved into the 20th century, we entered the age of the manager. Power became institutionalized. The great corporations were viewed as social organisms, employing hundreds of thousands of people in a symbiotic relationship between labor and capital. The executive was a steward of a massive workforce. To lead a company like General Motors or IBM was to lead a small nation. The status of the billionaire was tied to the scale of his payroll. Wealth was generated by the collective intelligence and physical effort of a massive, loyal middle class. For a brief moment in history, it seemed that the interests of the ruling class and the working class had found a fragile equilibrium. But that equilibrium was an anomaly. In the 21st century, we are witnessing a return to the older, more brutal logic of the empire. We are entering an era where power is once again becoming physical, static, and profoundly detached from the needs of the many. We are seeing the rise of the infrastructure lords, men who view the digital world not as a space for human connection, but as a territory to be fenced and taxed. And at the center of this transition is a company that has spent decades preparing for this very moment. On a Tuesday morning in late March 2026, the facade of the modern corporate contract finally cracked. At Oracle, a pillar of the technology establishment, thousands of individuals were severed from their livelihoods. The notifications did not come with the grace of a private meeting or the dignity of a long farewell. They arrived via automated systems, cold and final, across every time zone. To the casual observer, this was just another tech layoff, a standard adjustment to market conditions. But to those who follow the movement of true capital, it was something far more significant. It was the sound of a legacy empire shedding its skin. Oracle is a company built in the image of its founder, Larry Ellison. For 50 years, Ellison has operated with the strategic mind of a conquistador. He did not invent the database, but he conquered the market for it. He understood early on that in a world of chaotic information, the person who provides the structure is king. For decades, Oracle thrived as a software company, a firm that relied on the intellectual labor of thousands of engineers and the aggressive tactics of thousands of salesmen. But Ellison, perhaps sensing the coming shift before any of his peers, realized that software alone was no longer enough. Software is too fluid, too easily replicated, and too dependent on the shifting whims of human talent. To build a true dynasty in the age of artificial intelligence, one needs something more substantial. One needs the rails. The layoffs of 2026 are the direct result of this realization. Oracle is in the midst of a radical pivot, moving money away from payroll and toward the power grid. While the company was letting go of thousands of workers, it was simultaneously announcing a capital commitment of $50 billion to build out a massive network of data centers. This is not a story of a company in decline. This is a story of a company that is becoming an industrial utility. Oracle is no longer interested in being a software maker. It wants to be the physical landlord of the artificial mind. The financial logic is as clear as it is cold. A workforce of 162,000 people is a liability. Humans are expensive, they are slow, and they require constant maintenance. A data center, once built, is a monumental asset that generates revenue with minimal human intervention. Analysts at TD Cowen pointed out that by cutting between 20,000 and 30,000 employees, Oracle could increase its free cash flow by as much as $10 billion. In the calculus of the new ruling class, $10 billion in cash flow is far more valuable than 30,000 middle-class careers. That cash can be used to service the massive debt required to buy the silicon and the electricity that will power the future. This is the reordering of power. We are seeing a massive migration of capital from labor to infrastructure. The $50 billion Oracle raised in debt and equity earlier this year was not intended to spark innovation or to hire the best and the brightest. It was a down payment on the hardware of dominance. When Oracle signed a deal with OpenAI worth over $300 billion, it effectively secured its place as a toll collector on the most important highway of the 21st century. The remaining performance obligations of the company surged by 359% to $455 billion. These are the numbers of an empire, not a business. The shift is reflected in the very leadership of the firm. The departure of Safra Catz and the elevation of Mike Sicilia and Clay Magdeburg marks the transition from the era of financial engineering to the era of physical construction. These are the builders of the new grid. Their task is not to manage people, but to manage compute. As Magdeburg noted in a recent call, the demand for AI infrastructure continues to exceed supply. In this environment, the human element is a friction. The goal is to reach a state of pure capital, where the machine generates the wealth and the owners collect the rent. This is the return of the railroad baron. Just as Cornelius Vanderbilt realized that owning the tracks was more profitable than owning the trains, Larry Ellison has realized that owning the data centers is more profitable than owning the apps. The $50 billion in debt is the modern equivalent of the massive land grants given to the railroads in the 19th century. It is a bet that the future will be entirely dependent on this infrastructure, and that once it is built, no one else will be able to compete. But what does this mean for the nature of status and wealth? In the Gilded Age, the wealth of the Titans was at least partially shared with the millions of workers who built the country. In the age of the manager, wealth was distributed through the mechanism of the high-paying corporate job. But in the age of the infrastructure lord, wealth is becoming increasingly concentrated and increasingly automated. We are seeing the birth of a post-labor aristocracy. This is a class of people whose fortunes are entirely decoupled from the employment of the masses. They do not need a workforce to be powerful. They only need a server farm. The thousands of people let go by Oracle were not victims of a failing company. They were victims of a successful one. They were discarded because they were no longer necessary for the generation of value. This is the unsettling truth of the modern economy. As companies become more powerful, As their contracts grow into the hundreds of billions, and as their influence over the global economy expands, they are becoming less human. They are evolving into autonomous systems of capital that exist to serve their owners and their creditors, with little regard for the social fabric they leave behind.